Unfortunately, gun violence is in the news again today and all week after the Parkland shootings. Emotions are high, and all of us are feeling pretty intensely about what has happened and what's going to be done in response to it. As a parent who sends his two children to school every day, the Parkland situation is a nightmare that I can't wrap my head around. I think that the students who are passionately asking for change and organizing marches are heroes. I admire what they're doing, and I think that every bit of attention they're getting is justified, and in fact, if anything, they should get more. That being said, the conversation I want to have with you today is a little bit different because, as tragic as mass shootings are, as upsetting as homicide is, these things represent a small minority of gun deaths in America. The story of gun violence in the United States is a story about suicide. 2 out of every 3 firearm deaths in America is a suicide, and more than half of all American suicides result from firearms. Where I live in Mississippi, it's 70% or more over the past decade. This is an enormous toll of American lives. Over 22,000 firearm suicide deaths every single year, with the number rising. If we're going to talk about gun deaths in America, we need to talk about it in a way that fits the reality of the problem. We need to talk about suicide. If we're going to solve suicide, we have to talk about the 51% of the deaths that result from firearms, which means we have to have difficult conversations about guns. And those conversations are difficult. Emotions run high. People hear what they think someone's going to say rather than what they actually say. They respond to arguments that no one's making, and then we end up butting heads and dismissing one another as opposed to having productive conversations. So today what I want to talk to you about is what I think is important. One thing is passion. I think passion is vital. It's very good. People feel intensely on both sides of the issue of guns, and you could say that there's more than two sides. But people bring a lot of passion and energy to this conversation, and I would never argue that people should dismiss that. At the same time, we shouldn't confuse passion as the goal. Our goal isn't just to be upset, and our goal isn't just to yell. With respect to the community that I'm in, our goal is suicide prevention. Our goal is to prevent death to the extent that that is possible and to the greatest degree that we possibly can. So we have to focus on the actual goal rather than any other related conversation. Now, if you want to have a conversation about the Second Amendment and gun rights, by all means do it. That's an incredibly important conversation to have. But when you're talking about suicide, maybe don't have that conversation right off the bat, or not exclusively that conversation, because quickly it's going to devolve. All it takes is one quick look on the Facebook page for my lab, the Suicide and Emotion Dysregulation Lab, on a recent post advertising my new book, Guns and Suicide: An American Epidemic. And you can see how quickly people make assumptions about what I'm going to say, and how quickly they argue about things that I didn't say, and how quickly the conversation devolves away from one about suicide prevention and one about cultural identity and people coming and asking someone to change. That's not the goal. It isn't the goal. The goal is suicide prevention. You got to keep your eyes on the prize. In doing so, it's not all about compromise. It's also about keeping your eyes on the data. So when I say compromise, I think it actually makes a ton of sense to be reaching out to gun owners. You're not going to solve firearm suicide without firearm owners. No matter what legislation is passed, the bottom line is our country is inundated with firearms, and they're not going away anytime soon. And where I live, in Mississippi, they are more present than just about anywhere. And so to act as though that's not the case, and to act as though it's going to change in a way that it isn't going to change in the immediate future, is not productive. You have to work within the context of the reality that you're in. And so to give you a parallel, think about things like sex education. A lot of folks who have strong opinions against firearms have very strong opinions in favor of sex education. The argument goes, yes, the conservative view is that we should teach abstinence only, because without teenage sex, there's no teenage pregnancy. But then the other argument would say, but there is teenage sex. And so if we pretend that's not the case and don't provide sex education, we're going to have the outcomes we don't want. And so let's provide opportunities for safe sex. Let's educate people. Let's help them make informed, healthy decisions so we can save as many people as possible from the outcomes they're trying to avoid. Well, the same argument applies here. No matter how much you can conceivably and very reasonably argue that without firearms there'd be much fewer suicides, I would not argue against that at all. The fact is there are firearms. And so if we create a situation where you can't talk about the situation that you're actually in, you're not going to solve the problem. We have to understand that firearms do exist and that they're going to continue to exist. And so what we need to do is join forces with people to help the firearm community be safe. That isn't to say, again, that you can't have conversations about your own opinions about the firearms in general. I certainly have mine. But if you're talking about suicide prevention, you need to talk about suicide and you need to help people be safe so that they can stay alive, rather than have people simply feel judged so they tune you out and nothing happens. Your goal is change. It's not your goal to be right. Your goal is suicide prevention. It's not your goal to simply tell people to believe what you believe, no matter how passionately you believe it. This is a difficult task. I live this task on a daily basis, but the goal is suicide prevention, so we have to do that. That being said, it goes both ways here. In the conversation I've referenced from Facebook, several things happen that make a whole lot of logical errors. One of them is people will argue that there's a CDC conspiracy. The data isn't real. People will argue all sorts of things that don't make a lot of sense. And even within the suicide community, people will argue that things like universal background checks, mandatory waiting periods, or laws that make it easy for firearms to be taken away in moments of imminent risk are somehow coercive and inconsistent with the Second Amendment, or part of a slippery slope. Calling common sense solutions, things that have data supporting their association with lower suicide rates, coercive, does not help the cause of suicide. So it goes both ways. Yes, those who oppose guns need to understand and respect gun culture and work with those folks, but those who primarily support gun rights also need to accept reality as it is, not float conspiracy theories, and not paint things that are harmless as somehow pejorative and dangerous and part of a larger plan to take away guns when they are not. So what do I propose overall? Within the context of Mississippi, where I am, and the nation overall, I propose that we emphasize safe storage. Store your personal firearms unloaded, separate from ammunition, in a secure location like a gun safe, and ideally use a lock like a cable lock or a trigger lock as well. I understand that for a lot of folks who own firearms, the goal is personal protection, and the notion of storing your firearm that way makes you feel less safe. I can tell you the data on that. I know it's not going to convince you. So what I would say is be as safe as possible. Find some compromise. Move a little bit closer to that goal, because the early data, and we need a heck of a lot more on this, indicates that the degree to which you are safer with your firearm, the lower the risk is for yourself and others in your home. I'd also encourage folks in times of crisis, for themselves or anyone else in the home, to store their firearms away from the home during that crisis, just like we ask people to hold our keys when we've had too much to drink. Do this voluntarily, but also do it legally, knowing that where you live determines what is and is not a viable way to store your firearm outside of your home. I would also encourage people to consider promoting the passage of legislation that does not threaten the Second Amendment. Universal background checks, mandatory waiting periods, emergency protection orders. There are lots of things that could be done that make sense and save lives without representing an attack on a culture or an individual. All these efforts I'm talking about are referred to as mean safety, things that make a particular method for suicide less deadly or less available in a suicide attempt. These are not proposed to replace mental health care. They're proposed as a component that it needs addition. It's in addition to our current plan as part of a comprehensive suicide prevention strategy. It complements mental health care. Now, there are all sorts of counter arguments people will say that if someone that can't use a gun, they'll find another method. Or look at Japan, where there's no guns and the suicide rate is higher. That's a conversation I'm happy to have for you. It's too wordy to put into a YouTube video like this, but by all means, email me, michael.anestis@usm.edu. Contact me on social media, at psychbrownbag on Twitter, or on my lab page on Facebook. I'm happy to present the data on those things. The reality is, when you prevent someone from using a specific method for suicide, there's a very strong chance that you are saving their life and preventing them from ever attempting. I know that's not how most people think about suicide, but it's reality. I'm a scientist. I follow the data. The data sometimes takes us to places that are different than we expect to go, but it's our job as responsible individuals to follow that data rather than just our emotions, because that's what's going to take us to a path of true suicide prevention and accomplishing our broader goals as a suicide prevention community. If you or anyone else you know is having thoughts of suicide, 1-800-273-TALK is the National Suicide Prevention Hotline, and I would encourage you to reach out for help. And regardless, I really hope that you will take my advice seriously. Store your firearms safely. Temporarily store them away from home in times of crisis. Lives can be saved with simple behavioral change. Thank you very much.